Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have Tidbits. I'll give you a tour of Weldon's Practical Needlework Volume 10, and I've started the knitting stage of my hand-spun bead study. So let's get started. This tidbit came to me from Louise. It's a 30-minute YouTube video about a project taken on by a woman named Lois Oland, who has a farm and fiber business called Bellwether Wool in Oregon. So for those of you outside the U.S., that's the west coast of the U.S., just north of California. During the pandemic, when there were no fiber festivals and no paying visitors coming to the farm, taking classes, she had a lot of time on her hands and needed a project. So she took on a project to source fleeces, wool fleeces, from as many wool breeds as she could, particularly breeds she had only heard of and had never had a chance to spin with. When she could, she sourced raw fleece, but if she couldn't get a raw fleece, she bought whatever she could get in a given breed that was processed as little as possible, so that she could really see what the wool would have looked like right off the sheep. She meticulously tracked information like where the fleece came from, like who the seller was, and what state the fleece was in. Was it raw? Was it scoured, carded? As well as the quality of how that processing was done. She avoided buying comb top unless there was no other way of acquiring that particular breed. In some cases, she received poorly processed roving from a mill that was still learning how to properly process wool, and she gave them feedback to help them get better at it, because they were processing a number of rare breeds that she couldn't get anywhere else, and she really needed them to get better at what they were learning to do. She had 10 volunteer spinners of different spinning abilities to spin a small amount of each type of breed, and then they would provide feedback on what it was like to spin with that breed and what they thought the finished yarn might be good for. So she started out with 50 breeds, and then the project grew to 131, with some of the breeds in multiple colors. So there actually ended up being about 140 altogether. So one of her sample spinners actually wanted to spin all 131 breeds, and then she wove the wool that she had spun into a tapestry that's a scenery, an outdoor scene with sheep dotting the countryside. She even won a huge trophy for it as well. So if the wool came to Lois as raw or clean fleece, then she had to have it processed at a mill into roving, which she then packaged up into 1-ounce samples of each breed. So if you are the type of spinner who is interested in getting samples of 140 different breeds of wool without having to source or process it yourself, you can get them from her. She sells the wool in this, comes in a big bin with all 140 different wools, and includes a book that contains all of the information she compiled about the breed of sheep, the place where she bought the fleece from, what state it was in, feedback from the spinners who had spun with it. All of that kind of information is bound into a book that's included with it. So it's not cheap. It's $750, but it's probably the easiest way to get your hands on such a wide variety of wool breeds, along with all that information that she has compiled. So for context, I bought a 30 breed sampler from Etsy a couple of years ago, and that cost me $95. It was all combed top, so it was highly processed, and it didn't come with any information about the breeds or feedback on how other people chose to spin it and what they thought of those results. So I had to do all of that research myself and try to figure out the appropriate way to maybe spin this type of wool. So for those of you who aren't spinners and don't know much about how wool is processed, I'm going to go to the overhead and just give you a quick overview to show you some examples of washed fleece, carded fleece, roving, and then some comb top. I do have some raw fleece here in my office, but it's not readily accessible. So let's go to the overhead. I have some clean wool here in different states. I do have some raw fleece here in my office, but it's in a bin that's underneath a stack of other bins, and it would be, I have to take apart my whole closet in order to get it out. So this is some fleece that has been washed, and you can see the crimp in it. So the dirt and the lanolin has been, the sweat, all that has been taken out of it. You can see the little ends here that were, exposed the longest, and this is the part that was closest to the sheep's body. And you can see the curl and the crimp in it. So this would be a scoured, this is scoured fleece. It hasn't been prepared, it hasn't been combed or carded or anything like that. This is some fleece where, I took up, a bunch of this and I ran it through my drum carder. So it's, it's like a cylinder that's got all of these teeth on it, and it goes through and it cards the wool and prepares it so you can spin it. So this is essentially what's called a bat. And so you can strip off lengths of this, and then you could start spinning from that if you wanted to. So this is a bat that has been carded with a drum carder. So this is roving. It came from a small mill. And so this was also carded on a much bigger drum carder, and then it was turned into something that I could spin from pretty much directly. It's a small enough piece, and it's even enough that it would make it pretty easy to spin. So bats, these are bats and roving are woolen preparations. So the fibers are kind of separated from each other, but they're in all different directions. And so you could make a woolen spun yarn with this kind of woolen preparation. You could spin worsted, like there's a whole spectrum of how you can spin things. So I could take this and do kind of a worsted spinning with it. It would create sort of a mixture between, because of the woolen preparation and then the worsted spinning, you'd get kind of a hybrid type of a yarn. You can drum card, or you can do hand carding with this, two of these, and you're combing back and forth rather than cranking on a drum carder. If you use combs, you can use hand combs if you are preparing it at home. And that is going to line up all the fibers so that they are in parallel with each other and will be very smooth. And so you could do a worsted, this is a worsted preparation, and then you could spin worsted and get a very smooth yarn. You can also take a worsted preparation and spin woolen by doing things that will cause the fibers to kind of disorganize themselves as you're spinning. So when you go to a fiber festival, a lot of times they're selling combed top. And so what they do in a mill is they card it like they do for any wool preparation, but then they run it through these pins that kind of and they'll do this a number of times, run it through the machine that does the pin combing a number of times in order to get it as straight as possible. So this is a very smooth preparation. It's also the preparation that's hardest to tell by looking at it what the original fleece would have been like. Like when you look at something like this, then you have a pretty good idea of, just looking at it, you can see the staple length of the wool. You get an idea of how much crimp that there is in it, and you can like boinga, 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 boinga. But you look at this and you're like, well, what's going to happen? In order to figure out what the staple length is, you have to pull some of it out of the top and then kind of see how long that is in there. So this is a pretty long staple length. So that just gives you a little indication of what the woman who was creating this breed study, she wanted to get things as close to the original fiber. She was trying to get raw fleece. If she couldn't, she'd get washed, but she was trying to stay away from the combed top. In some cases, she couldn't because that was the only way to get that particular breed. But in many cases, she was able to either get a bat or she could get roving. So So those are the different sort of levels of wool, unspun wool that you go through as you go from the raw fleece onward. This tidbit came to me from Marymath on Ravelry. It's an article about the sweaters in the recent movie called Banshees of Inisherin. The movie is set in the 1920s on the fictional west coast island of Inisherin, Ireland. Many people have noticed the sweaters in this movie, including my daughter Nina, who just learned to knit this past October. The sweater Nina had noticed, and the one that they talk about in the article that Marymath sent, is the one worn by, or one of the ones that is worn by Colin Farrell. That collar on that sweater is just such a nice touch. The article, which I will link to down in the show notes, is an interview with the 83-year-old woman who knit the sweaters for the film. And I think a lot of you will agree that knitwear in films and on TV can be really fun to analyze, and a lot of times people want to copy those designs and knit them up themselves, but it's always been a mystery to me as to what sort of person gets asked to knit the things that are not off the rack and that are clearly hand knit. So I found another article about the sweaters from that film where they talked to the designer, not the knitter. The original sweater was actually a brighter red, and they decided that it looked too modern, so they went with a darker one, which meant the knitter had to make that sweater twice. And I don't know why they wouldn't have just dyed it, unless they wanted to have the brighter one just in case. I don't know. But the timing of all of that movie sweater talk ended up being really perfect because the Minnesota Knitters Guild just had Krista from Explore with Knitsy for our February program. She knits for TV shows and movies, and she explained how she got into it and what the process is like, and talked about the different things that she knit for different programs and movies. And it was really eye-opening because I just had no idea how people got into it. And I thought maybe it would sound like a fun thing to do. But as it turns out, there are just so many different aspects of knitting that are outside of my own experience. And in the case of knitting for film and television, probably outside of my ability in terms of the deadlines and the remaking of things, and then planning ahead for how I might redo something in the easiest way if I needed to. So in that movie with Colin Farrell, she ended up having to knit it twice, but Krista talked about having sometimes such a short turnaround that she needed to be able to take apart the thing that she had knit and find a way to adjust it if there was some sort of problem, rather than having to re-knit something completely from scratch. Because even if you knit it perfectly, exactly to the specifications of the actor's body and exactly the way the designer asked you to knit, there could be something wrong with it that isn't your fault. Like the color ends up being brighter than they thought they wanted, or they wanted this to be a little bit different. They want the stitch pattern to be slightly different, and then you'd have to rip everything out and redo it. So it's fascinating to learn about and to understand the reality of something that as a fantasy seems like it would be really fun to do. So I think it takes a very particular type of personality to be able to do something like that and want to do it and be willing to do it. So I will leave the articles down below, as well as I'll leave a link to Krista, the woman we had for our program. You can see her blog. She's just a really interesting woman, and you can learn a lot more about the whole process of knitting for film and TV from her. I don't have a note about who sent me this tidbit, so I think it must have been a YouTube recommendation for me, which must have just shown up in my feed. So this tidbit is a film that was recorded, I'm guessing, in the 1960s. It is interviews of several women in their 90s who were teenagers and young women in the late Victorian era. They talk about what their lives were like at that time, and it's interesting in general, but one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting was the description of how much time they spent on maintaining their clothing. One of them was living in London working as a typist. Typewriters were a new thing back then. And she said the streets were so muddy back then that their skirts would just be caked with mud by the time they got home. And then they'd have to spend hours brushing the mud out of those skirts. They also spent considerable amount of time darning and mending their knitted stockings. So they included photographs of these elderly women in their youth so that you could see what they looked like at the time that they were living through these stories that they're telling. In one photo, you can see that as a young woman, she is posing with her beloved bicycle, wearing her bicycling outfit, which kept the skirts hiked up while she was biking and then could be lowered when she got to a destination and be more appropriate for walking along the sidewalks. So of course, I'll leave a link down in the show notes to that video. It's really worth taking a look at it. So for the past couple of months, I've been showing you volumes of Weldon's practical needlework, focusing on the knitting issues within each of these volumes. There's always a variety of knitted items in these books, but one of the things that pops up every now and then are doilies. Here's an example of some of those doilies. I had a comment recently asking about the spelling of the word doily in these old publications. The way we spell doily today is D-O-I-L-E-Y, but the way that Weldon's spelled it was capital D, apostrophe, capital O, Y-L-E-Y. So there is one explanation that comes up over and over about this spelling difference, and I'll leave a link to a piecework article on doilies down below that briefly explains the origin of the word within that article. But essentially, there was a London cloth merchant back in the 16th century whose name was Doiley. There were a couple of different spellings of his name back then, some with D-O-Y and some with D-O-I. Because spelling just wasn't standardized at that point in time. From what I have been able to find, there was no apostrophe in his name at that period of time when he was showing up in the lists of merchants, regardless of how it was spelled, and probably with good reason. The apostrophe was just starting to enter into the English language. You know, punctuation was a fairly new thing back then, and the apostrophe was one of the newest entrants. So Doiley, the cloth merchant, sold open work cloth items. Potentially that meant bobbin lace. And by the 1700s, long after he was dead, lacy napkins were called doily napkins. And then eventually just doily was applied to those circular items that covered so much of the furniture back then. So my guess about the spelling D apostrophe capital O Y-L-E-Y is that that was just a Victorian invention. The spelling D-O-Y-L-E-Y is just as valid as D-O-I-L-E-Y, but the apostrophe likely wasn't in his surname at the time he was alive. In December 2022, I purchased a 12-volume set of Weldon's Practical Needlework. These are facsimile copies of the first 12 years Weldon's published its popular series starting in 1886. So these facsimile copies were published by Piecework magazine in the early 2000s. And each volume represents one full year of monthly issues, with each issue devoted to a particular needlecraft, like knitting, crocheting, edgings, patchwork, macrame, tatting, embroidery, etc. So each week, I've been giving you a tour of one of the volumes. Piecework no longer sells the facsimile hard copy versions, but they do sell digital copies of the knitting and crocheting issues on their website. So let's go to the overhead and explore what volume 10 has for us. The issues in this volume were originally published in 1895. So this is the facsimile edition of Weldon's Practical Needlework, Volume 10. In Volume 10, we've got the very first series of applique embroidery. They always are coming up with a new type of embroidery, it seems, every year. For crochet, we have the 24th series all the way to the 27th series. So there were 4 issues devoted to crochet. For knitting, we have the 27th, 28th, and 29th series. So if you happen to see something that you like when I'm going through the knitting, you can actually get digitized copies of the Practical Needle or Practical Knitting from Piecework magazine. So you'd need to know the 27th, 28th, and 29th. They tend to bundle them together, but sometimes the bundles might span more than 1 year. I think it just depends on how they decided to do things. But the other things that we have here, we've got 4 other crafts where we have the very first series of each one. We've got leatherwork, pin cushions, point lace, and ribbon plating. So I am going to just briefly go through a few of these later, just to give you a quick look of what some of these things are, because sometimes it's just like, what does that even mean? But let's start with the knitting. So the first of the 3 issues is how to knit edgings and insertions for trimming purposes. So sometimes not only are they focusing on one craft, they're focusing on one element of that particular craft, and this one is different types of embellishments. So this one is a tassel. They've got various different sorts of borders that are pretty fancy. And I am looking at some of these and I'm thinking I might get some inspiration for a summer top that I want to knit with some linen yarn. And I've been looking at, some interesting lace patterns that I might want to use. And I'm seeing some things here like this I really quite like a lot. So I might go back and look at some of these patterns and see if I might want to use them for my project. So that's the first one. So in this 28th series, we've got how to knit quilts, borders, socks, stockings, vests, etc. So like always, there's a little infant's booty of some sort in here. We've got a skirt. This is probably, well, I don't know. They aren't saying it. Usually these are like petticoats, underskirts. We've got a gentleman's shooting stocking. And then we've got a pin cushion here that's knitted like a lemon. They like to make things that look like fruits, I've noticed. So we've got another border and a cable knit insertion here. We've got baby's pilt, or which we would call, what do we call those here in the US? I can't remember. There's some, but it's like a diaper cover, a wool diaper cover. Then we've got an undervest here with moderately high neck and long sleeves. Got a square for a quilt. Oh, this is one that I thought was funny. I saw this here. There's instructions for an egg cozy. And then here's the picture of it over here. So I guess if you have like a soft-boiled egg for breakfast or something and you want it to stay hot, you put a little egg cozy on it. I like that they have these kind of whimsical tiny projects that are quick to knit, because otherwise if you're facing something like a gentleman's shooting stocking that's boring and it's going to take you forever, I can see why you'd want to use up little oddments of colors to make something like that. We've got another square for a quilt here. Got some stockings, a child's petticoat with bodice, a little Cavendish boot. And then I thought this was interesting. They're actually calling this a boy's sweater. So a lot of times they're calling things jerseys. And certainly in the UK nowadays, they would call something like this a jumper. And it's interesting to me to see them calling this a sweater, because that would be what we called it in the US. And because during this time frame, like when I was looking up sweaters in newspapers from this era, in British newspapers, a sweater was somebody who ran a sweatshop. And sometimes it meant that in the US, but anytime they meant it as a garment like this, a lot of times they had it in quotation marks and might even define what they meant by that. So that's just interesting to me to see that they're calling this a sweater at that time. We've got some more socks, a little beaded trimming, another sock, and then we've got an undervest for a little girl. So now we've got the 29th series. So this is designs for quilts, corners, and borders. So this is another sort of kind of embellishment type of thing rather than clothing, which is kind of unusual. I don't think I've seen a volume that had this little in the way of clothing previously. Hexagon, hoop and Van Dyke edging, more quilt squares. We've got corners, the tufted triangle. Got some diamonds. More triangles. We've got one up here and one down there. And then we've got these kind of rhombus shaped pieces here. So I want to quickly go through like one of these I thought was really interesting. I think sometimes Weldon's practical pin cushions, and I'm like, practical? Really? These look like fun and whimsical, but not terribly practical pin cushions to me. So they have all of these different shapes of things. And obviously these are hand sewn and use all different, this isn't knitting. But this is what I wanted to show you. So I've seen this in like a lot of times in other needlework books, like encyclopedia type of things, or sewing patterns even, they'll have multiple pattern pieces all overlaid on one sheet of paper. And they have a key down here that is telling you, oh, this one A, and that this line design right here is for the outline for the bow cushion. And then this one is for folly, cock, heart, vase, etc. So you look at the thing that you want, like if you were looking for A, and you're looking for a dash with a dot. It's interesting. So this could be, because I'm like, is it B or A? But this is A, and it's this right here coming around like this. So that would be what you would trace in order to get the correct shape. So this I thought was just interesting because it isn't something that we would see nowadays at all, I don't think. I think they should call this Weldon's Wildly Impractical Pin Cushions is what they should call it. Practical ribbon plating. And so what it is you're actually weaving. So they have a weaving needle that they're attaching to the ribbon here, clips onto it. And then you make all of these different kinds of decorative things by weaving those ribbons together. I do wonder if you have to then sew the edges on, because it's not like you could go back up and the other way, or I don't know, unless you're hiding the edges. Because if something is that wide, how do you turn the corners? I wonder if they actually explain it. A considerable quantity of ribbon is required for even a small piece of plating, and it is advisable to lay in a good stock whenever opportunity offers. By watching the shops, advantage may often be taken of the sale of a salvage or a bankrupt stock. As a rule, the narrower ribbons are more expensive in proportion than are the wider ones, but of course, the latter are not suited for every purpose. At some shops, the reduction may be obtained when the ribbons are bought by the dozen yards. So they're giving you shopping tips on how to score a good deal on ribbon for this. So all kinds of projects for that sort of thing. And it's not something I have seen before in a craft book. I think I've probably seen, things that were woven with ribbon, but I don't know that I ever thought about that as a craft that would have been practiced earlier on. My plans for Finish It February included figuring out what to do with the 30 skeins of hand spun that I ended up with when I did a breed study. So I did the breed study year to year and a half ago, somewhere around there. It took a period of time for me to get through all 30. So my plan was that I was going to turn these skeins into some sort of knitted textile piece of fabric, sort of like a blanket. I didn't know how big it would end up being, but I wanted to be able to use it as a reference. I didn't want to knit individual swatches, put them in a sheet protector in a binder and shove them on a shelf, because I am very much out of sight, out of mind. I wanted to turn them into something that would be visible in my office that I could easily get my hands on, where each breed would be knit into a distinct element of this textile and be labeled on the back. So that was my plan, but I kept getting stymied because these yarns weren't all knit or spun exactly the same. There's a variety of yarn weights, and there's a variety of colors as well. So because there are different yarn weights and there's different yardages for them, I just wasn't sure how I was going to handle that. And one thought I had was knitting like a modular piece of some sort that I could just knit until I was out of that color, and then before going on to the next one. But I really like having a plan, and I'm not that good at just winging things. So everything just sat in a bin that I never saw or thought about. For Finish It February, I wanted to make some decisions about this. And the second half of February, I wasn't feeling well and I wasn't knitting much. I wasn't doing any Finish It February things. So this past week, because I'm feeling 100% better, I can get back to work on that. So in order for me to just be thinking about this constantly, I just put all of the wool on the floor of my office so that I would be forced to see it and step over it. And I would see it multiple times a day, and it would be annoying that it would be on the floor, and it would just force me to really figure these things out. So I'm going to go to the overhead and kind of show you what I have and what I've started and kind of what I figured out. So these are 29 of the 30 skeins of yarn that I spun up. These 4 right here are long wools, and the one that's missing is also a long wool. That's the one I'm currently working with. This is the one I started with. So up here I have 11 colored yarns. Now the one at the very edge is Shetland, and I could put it in amongst these sort of natural colored ones that go from almost white to kind of a yellowish color. But it somehow, I can't figure out where to actually put it. It almost has like a brown or cooler undertone than these other ones seem to be kind of warmer in the more yellowy range. So I haven't quite figured out what to do with that Shetland yet. But I laid these on the floor because when they're sitting in the bin where they've been stored for the past, I don't know, year or so, I wasn't seeing them, I wasn't thinking about them. And so by putting them on the floor here, I have to walk past or over these, step over these every time I come in and out of my office, because the door to my office is in that direction. My desk is in this direction, where I have my computer and everything. The table where I sit to record is over there, and the table where my sewing machine is set up is over there. So I have to walk past this, and it just forces me to think about this multiple times a day as I go to get something to eat or go to the bathroom, whatever. I'm constantly forced to think about this. So these are the yarns that I'm dealing with. So let me move back to my normal overhead position, and I'll show you the yarn that I'm actually working on first. These are the 5 long wools, and I decided to start with these just because of the nature of this wool. They produce very different yarn than the other breeds that I used in the study. So here is an example of just the wool that's kind of not really spun right here. This is the one that I'm starting with, is called Lincoln, and it is often crossbred with fine wool breeds in order to produce something that has strength and a long staple and as well as softness. So this is pretty much just like a wiry, it's kind of like horsehair in a way. It's just a very long staple. These fibers are just super long, and they kind of spun up into almost like a twine. It's not that rough, but like this isn't something that I would use for a garment. So I wanted to start with the Lincoln because I think I have the least amount of yardage of Lincoln. Even though I started with an ounce of everything, it spun up into less yardage because it's just very, the fibers are very parallel, very condensed together. They're not, it's not fluffy and separated, which would allow me to spin it finer. So I decided that what I wanted to do was to make 6-inch by 6-inch squares. I just gave up on the idea of trying to do something fancy, and I'm going to do plain squares that have some garter stitch in along the borders. And then stockinette in the center. Now, when I get to some of the finer weights, first of all, I have to have more stitches and smaller needles in order to make something 6 inches wide, but I'll also be working with yarn that would be more typical of something that I'd want to make a garment out of, so I might do some more experimenting with stitch patterns in those squares. But for this one in particular, it's going to be a plain old 6 by 6 inch square that's mostly in stockinette. And so I'm using this technique of calculating the yarn weight based on what are called wraps per inch. Let me get a better ruler than what I have. So you can get these little tools that basically have, you know, some sides on the edges here or along the edges here, like that might mark off a full inch but will give you a little border so that you can wrap it around and know that you're within 1 inch, but you can also do it on a ruler. So I have never really understood how this worked, and I finally saw a video that explained it in a way that made sense because I never knew how tight or loose I was supposed to wrap something. And the way that the video I saw explained it, and please correct me if this is not right, is that as you are wrapping around the ruler in between the 1 inch marks, that you want it to be right next to each other where they're rolling over the top. And that's going to cause them to spread out a little bit. And they might be further apart along this part, but you don't want them to be, you know, necessarily right next to each other on the flat part of the ruler and then be crowded along that top part. So you do this, you wrap it around until you have filled up in between a 1 inch mark, and then you do that a few different times and then average it out. So I did that for this one, and it came out to be like an Aran weight. So something that should be knit at about 4.5 stitches per inch. For 6 inches, that would be, what, 27 stitches. I actually cast on a few less than that in order to work the garter stitch, because garter stitch tends to spread, at least it does for me, because it compresses in the rows. And so it compresses this way, and that kind of causes the stitches to spread a little bit. And so then when I switched to the stockinette, I added a few stitches because I knew the stockinette was going to not be quite as wide. So I do have, I think, 26 or 27 stitches across here now that I'm working in stockinette, but I started with fewer because I didn't want the garter stitch part to be wider. I wanted it to be pretty much the same. So as I'm working through each of these yarns, I'll have to do the wraps per inch thing. This one is obviously a finer yarn right here. And these all kind of range. This one is probably the roughest, the most like twine, the one that I would really not want to knit with. Might be good for a rug yarn. This is Devon. Some of these are actually very nice in the hand. So they could be okay for, you know, some kind of a garment. Like this is, which one is this? This is Teeswater. This one is Massam. not quite as soft. I think tea sweater is very nice. And this one is very nice too. This one is Wensleydale. So this one I was able to spin quite a bit finer and get quite a bit more yardage with it than I was with this. So that is what I decided to do, is just go for, at least for at the beginning, with things where it makes sense, is just go for a 6 by 6 inch square. And if I want to get creative later on with some of the others and do cables or try some kind of a knit purl stitch pattern or something, I am free to do that. But I thought the easiest thing, the thing to actually get me started, would be to start with the thing that has the least yardage, in order to make sure that I can get something that is 6 inches by 6 inches, and then go from there. I'm sure I'll have leftovers of quite a few of the yarns, and that is perfectly fine. I could then move on to doing some dyeing experiments potentially. So I said that I really don't like winging things, but I think I needed some kind of structure in order to continue building this. And so my structure is 6 inch squares and not doing anything modular. I can't stand doing like top-down seamless sweaters, because I don't like having the entire sweater on the needles. I don't like having the whole thing. I like working in smaller pieces. So the whole idea of a modular blanket, I think was one of the things that was keeping me from getting started, because I was kind of dreading what that would be like as it got bigger and bigger. So just good old 6 inch squares seems to be the way to get going on it. And it also gives me the flexibility of getting fancier with some of the yarns where I feel like I'm like, oh, I could really do something with this particular yarn that I couldn't necessarily do with one of the other yarns. So that, gave me the kick in the butt, putting everything on the floor, and I got started on it. So I'm hoping to just, it's one of those things where I can do a square at a time and in between different projects. So I just wanted to get going on it and have a plan, and I have one. So I'm very happy.